Well, it's really a pleasure to introduce our two speakers this afternoon, Dr. James Keaton and his colleague, Dr. Charles Soukup. I was Dean of Students when they were at UNC. Well, they're still at UNC. And I was, yes. So they're great. And Jim Keaton is the one that I know the best, and he's just really well loved on campus. I'm sure you are too, Charles. Let me just tell you a little bit about them. Jim Keaton is a professor as well as department chair of communication studies in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at UNC. He started at UNC in 1991, teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in intercultural communication, quantitative research methodology, leadership, and interfaith communication. He received his PhD in research and statistics and speech communication from Penn State and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in comparative world religions at Harvard University. Something I didn't know, that's impressive. He is the recipient of both the College Scholar Award and the Distinguished Scholar Award at UNC. And in recognition of his teaching, he was the recipient of the Mortarboard Favorite Professor Award and Professor of the Year awarded by UNC Student Senate. And I worked with both of those groups, so I know that's a really high honor. Dr. Soukup is also professor in communication studies at UNC. He came to UNC in 2001, and his research and teaching emphasized the role of technology and media in the formation of culture and community. He received his PhD in communication studies from the University of Nebraska in 2000 and has received many awards for papers he's written. So these two professors have a particular interest in interfaith dialogue, and they are very accomplished and respected contributors to the field. They've authored several chapters in several books, and their program today is The Promise and Challenge of Interfaith Dialogue in a Time of Polarization. So I think this is very timely. We're really excited to hear you. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Keaton and Dr. Charles Soukup.
Well, as we get started, I'm glad when we were going through this four-way test, I was thinking about our presentation and I thought, okay, yes, yes, yeah. So I think we passed. I think we passed for that. Today, why don't we just go to the, we're just cutting a little bit of time here so we have enough time for questions. There we go. Which we really do enjoy. Charles and I started, I guess I need to stand over here if I'm going to be on camera. Charles and I started right after 9/11, when some of our students in the intercultural communication class approached us and said, we have friends that are Muslims. Do I even bring up the topic of 9/11? What do I say? What don't I say? I don't want to distance myself from this person, but at the same time, I don't want to be offensive. What do we do? And so Charles and I looked at the journals, and believe it or not, there's very little out there about how to talk to the other, whether it's the religious other or the political other. And so we went on a journey of now, what are we, 17 years in? I think we are, trying to provide realistic answers about this. What I'd like to do for you now is show you a model of some of the responses that we found in our research. How, when you encounter a person that seems to be different than you are, whether it's religiously different or politically different, what are some of the common responses? And these responses, by the way, for those of you that are academics, Gene, you know this, we break everything into a 4-quadrant taxonomy. That's all we do. That's pretty much all we do in our research. And so we found that there are really two dimensions that undergird the notion of otherness. One is when you encounter somebody that seems to be different than you are, what do? Do you tend to find common ground as soon as possible because difference is uncomfortable? Or are you okay with difference and you tend to revel in the notion that we truly can have different experiences? That's one thing that we talk about. And then where would we press to go to the next?
I think you use that little guy.
Okay, go to the click. Let's go to that little guy there. Hey, there we go. Hey, okay. And the other is, how open are you to the experiences of others? And so when you encounter somebody that's different, do you actively want to hear and learn about their life world, or would you rather keep them at a distance under the notion of tolerance and appreciation, but maybe not engagement? And those two things actually brought up 4 responses. And what I'd like to do is we're going to go through each of the 4 and then talk about a little bit of the challenges. I'm going to pass it off. We're going to do a little back and forth here. So Charles is going to talk a little about exclusivism.
So if you want to imagine exclusivism, just watch cable news for a while, and you're going to have a pretty good idea of how people tend to communicate, thinking that they have all the answers and everybody else is wrong, right? That's basically what exclusivism is. And as you might imagine, you're probably going to be very monologic, right? You're going to take up a lot of space, and you're going to try to convert people to your point of view. So it tends to be very argumentative, or the alternative is, if you're an exclusivist, you just stay in your own tribe, because what's the point, right? Why would you even engage with the other? Because I know I'm right, I know they're wrong. They probably think they're right, but they're not really right. So let's not even talk about anything. And so from a communication point of view, it tends to be either engaging with the other through argument, or essentially ignoring the other and avoiding conversation altogether. So that'll turn things over to Jim for our next quadrant.
You forgot to click. So reductionism, let me give you an idea now within the faith traditions. If you were a Christian, which I would imagine most people in this room are, and we're trying to understand, say, Judaism, we're trying to understand Islam, one of the things the reductionist does is they view other religions through the lens of their own tradition and what's important to them. So for example, a Christian might look at Judaism and say, well, they acknowledge Jesus was a person and a great teacher, but not the savior. And we take a look at Islam and you go into the Quran, and there are many mentions of Jesus as not as a savior, but as a great prophet, spoke the very first day he was born, etc. But you notice what I'm doing. I'm taking the notion of difference and boiling it into the categories and the lens that I use, and ignoring everything else. So in that sense, I'm seeking similarities, but only what's important to me as a person. And so it's a very analytical perspective. It's almost a conversation that you would find in academic discourse as well. To Charles to talk about relativism.
So with relativism, I mean, the kind of short answer to what relativism is the sort of kumbaya around the campfire where everybody's holding hands and we all get along. And what it's trying to do is only see similarities, right? And I always think of this as sort of the aerial view when you're in an airplane, or like the satellite pictures that you see where everything is sort of blurry and everything sort of looks the same and everybody looks the same from that perspective. But of course, you're ignoring the profound differences that are between people, but it just intends to do that, to just ignore all of those differences and only see the things that we share in common. But those differences are real, right? They're really ignoring things that are profound in terms of our values, in terms of our practices, et cetera. But it's essentially trying to erase all of that difference. And that, of course, is something that's problematic. But in terms of communication, it's sort of pretending those differences aren't even there, right? It's essentially talking as though we're all essentially the same. And so I'll flip that to then our final quadrant, which is pluralism.
And by the way, in that sense, if you were to talk about difference with the relativistic point of view, you would say things, well, a lot of that was really the product of the history and the time. But when you think about it, there's a common goal. The golden rule applies to everything. We all have different ways of praying. So what you would do is boil down all the differences to get to those kumbaya moments to say, we're really the same. It's just the cultural stuff that gets in the way, which is at times problematic. When we get to pluralism, you know, it's the last one, so it's the one we advocate. I mean, we're pretty open about that one. Pluralism is the notion that you're open to the experiences of others, but you view difference as a source of understanding. So if you think about this response, it's almost an ethnographic or anthropological response. So for example, if you were to go to travel to a place, I traveled to Japan a heck of a lot. One of the things that you would do is you'd stop, you'd pause and take it in. You wouldn't analyze it. You would just attempt to take it in and understand, set yourself aside, understand what you're engaging in. From a religious other point of view, it would be, okay, you're Islamic. Tell me about fasting. I hear a lot about fasting and there's a whole month of Ramadan. Why do you do that? What's it like? Tell me about your everyday experience. And then our goal would be to step aside, vicariously experience through the life world of the other, and then take ourselves back out to understand. So the goal there is not to agree. As a matter of fact, difference is a very good thing. The goal is truly to understand the person, even though you might not agree with what they're saying. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the challenges of dialogue and pluralism. How many folks are comfortable with uncertainty? If somebody says something and you don't really understand it, do you go out of your way to kind of think about what they meant to plug it in that evening? How many folks do that? Come on. Okay, there's a lot of liars in here. Because we do not like the notion of anxiety. There's something we call in social science research primary tension. When you get a group of people together, it's uncomfortable. So you try to find ways to dispel that anxiety. With dialogue and with pluralism, you have to be comfortable with the fact that you never truly will understand the other person. But that's okay. Because if you boil them down into something that's easily understandable, you're not understanding them at all. Charles?
All right. So one of the mistakes we sometimes make when we engage with the other, with people who are different from ourselves, and kind of go back to cable news, is our job is to get everybody to agree, right? And if you really think about it, one of the ironies is we think of exclusivists and relativists as being really different from one another, but at their heart, they share one thing in common. We all have to get along because we all have to agree on everything, right? And that to me is one of the great mistakes that we make when we encounter differences, because we set that as our goal, which is a kind of fool's errand, right? Why is agreement the ultimate goal that you should have for an encounter with someone different from yourself? Shouldn't you just simply be trying to understand the other? Just simply reframing the experience and thinking of the goal as being understanding rather than agreement completely changes the experience, right? It allows you then to have differences present and not even have to worry about them, right? Why are these differences something that we need to address? Why are these differences things that we need to argue out or hash out? Instead, they can just be present, and you can come to some kind of understanding. And that, for us, is one of those key principles that can help guide these sorts of encounters. And so I'll go to our next one, which is the allure of tribalism.
How many sports fans do we have? Sports fans, you better say that, Neil, right? There is a growing trend known as tribalism. Are you hearing this word, tribalism?
Yes.
The notion of us versus them, right versus wrong, separating camps into almost a childish designation of who's good and who's evil. Well, there is an allure to tribalism. The allure is it's fun to be right, and it's fun when the person that's opposed to you has a bad day or somebody slams them, or in sports, maybe it's the final buzzer and you win the game. It's a fun form of communication, but it's extremely dangerous. I've noticed this if you watch the late night talk shows. Often they'll get applause lines when the other is slammed because people really enjoy this. But if you think about it, tribalism doesn't really work if the tribes want to interact with one another. And so there's that allure of, I want to be amongst the right, and I want to have those moments of superiority, or schadenfreude, for those folks that know that term, the delight we have when something goes wrong to the other person. Well, that's dangerous when it comes to this notion of encountering the other.
One of the basic principles of communication is the idea of reciprocity. That is, we tend to respond in kind when we're communicating with others. And one of the things that can happen is if you see someone who's crossed their legs, you've probably seen the phenomenon where you'll start to cross your leg too, and you don't even kind of realize why, because we just sort of mirror one another. And one of the things that can happen is we not only mirror our nonverbal behavior, we mirror our verbal behavior as well. And so if someone comes in really hot and they're arguing with you, how are you probably going to respond, right? You're probably going to come back really hot, and you're going to come back with an argument defensively. And so one of the things that is so important is sort of disrupt that pattern, to start to think about other kinds of habits in terms of how we respond to the other. And as we had stated before, this idea of beginning the conversation from the principle of understanding can help then to just create a different kind of energy. And of course, if you enter the conversation with that energy, the principle of reciprocity would tell us they're probably going to respond in kind as well. So if you simply say, I'm going to tell a story about my experience to help you understand where I'm coming from, what do you think the other person's going to do? They're going to tell you a story, and they're going to tell you a little about their experience. And suddenly you're understanding each other. You're no longer arguing with each other. And so that's one of the simple things that we can change in our everyday lives, and just how we encounter differences.
And lastly, in the challenges, I use this term all the time. I don't think Charles likes it yet, but I call it limbic regression. I think we as a society are actually going to the center of our brain. We're actually fighting evolution, I think. And what I mean by that is we tend to rely on an area of the brain known as the amygdala. And the amygdala pretty much determines, is the person friend or foe? Do I like them or do I dislike them? And so when we encounter difference, if we are in a limbic mood, what ends up happening is we're waiting for you to say the one thing that I'm going to jump on, or I already disagree with you. I'm not listening. I'm formulating my argument with you. So I encounter difference with an attack defend mode. I think we're getting more and more like this. For those of you that watch C-SPAN because you can't sleep like I can't, you'll notice that the limbic responses have really become the ones that are played now over and over again. The slams, those great moments. Can you believe this person said that? We're starting to get addicted to this notion of the emotional gratification rather than truly understanding each other. So with that in mind, there are a couple of things that we would say. One is that we really want to get away from tribalism, even though it feels good, it's dangerous. And the other is really diversity has to be interpreted as a strength. And what we mean by that is, in a Jewish proverb, there's blessed is the person who's wrong, because they have something to learn. And I'm wondering why our notion of agreement and emotional easiness has become the #1 way of approaching the religious other. So with that in mind, what we'd like to do, let me go past these. What time do we have, Gene? I'm sorry. Yeah, we wanted to open it up for questions, if that's okay, because normally that's the most fun to talk about. Questions? Please.
What are some of the ways you kind of introduce these practices and context in the classroom? I mean, you know, it's obviously valuable information, but this is truly something that needs to be done in person, live with another human being instead of reading the textbooks. What are some of the scenarios you guys create to?
Can you guys try to repeat the question, because the Zoomers will be lost?
So the question was related to how we utilize these principles in the classroom to help students go into sort of real world settings. I ask students to actually go into the real world setting. I have assignments where they actually go out and encounter people who are different from themselves and interact with each other. I have them interact with each other and find someone who is either different in terms of their culture, religion, politics, and they have to talk and share with each other. So it's very, very much actually doing it. And they're reticent, it's hard. One of the things that we're not claiming is that this is some sort of panacea, some magic pill where this is all easy. It's hard work, right? It's not easy to change these patterns. And the sort of default mode of just being, as you said, limbic, right? That is just easier, but it is something that is incredibly satisfying. And that's what students will talk about. Have them journal their experiences, and then they'll come back and say, this was truly kind of life-changing, that it helped me to see things in a way and see myself. Because one of the things that these kinds of encounters can do, sharing experiences and creating understanding, is suddenly we understand our own culture, our own faith in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise, right? It isn't a state of vulnerability, it's a state of strength that comes out of it, which is, I think, one of the exciting things, is that I think we think that if we're going to share understanding, that somehow, I don't know, we're going to lose our faith or we're going to lose our culture, but it's literally just the opposite. We become much stronger from the experience.
Yeah, I would also add to that. It's interesting for people that travel. If I go to Japan and I like the food and I like the stories, does that mean I want to be Japanese? No. So if I want to know more about Islam and the practices, does that mean somehow I'm questioning my own Christianity? Doesn't that seem rather odd that people avoid these conversations because they view it as a sign of weakness or vulnerability? And we found the exact opposite. The other thing that we found, remember our first study in BeliefNet, we did one of the first studies and we found one of the traps of religious conversation as well as political conversation. You can substitute everything we just said, substitute political for religious, and the same kind of thing happens. We're talking about ideologies here. We found that when people talk about, for example, are you a true conservative? Or are you a true Christian? You get into these arguments about like Roman Catholicness. And do you really practice all the sacraments? Well, that's not how I understand Catholicism, or that's not how I understand what it means to be progressive. So the notion of getting into categories tends to lead to argument and who is the prototype and who's not. So that's why we're finding the notion of authority and experience, not authority in categories. So, next question.
What techniques do you use if you find yourself slipping into a limbic response to get yourself calmed down enough that your adrenaline isn't tearing you off the battle?
That is a great question.
Repeat that.
The question is, what do you do? There's the camera as well. Hey, Zoomers. That's what we should say. Hey, Zoomer, not Boomer, but Zoomer. What I would recommend strongly, if you're feeling that limbic response, which is taking you out of the conversation, is to practice some things called meditation. I don't think we control our minds well enough, especially in conversation. Often conversation I consider to be dueling monologues, which means you talk, I'm formulating, then I talk, and no one's hearing each other. We're just pretending like we are. So our ability to shut off that talk and attend is very important. We do it in the movies. When it's a really good movie, don't you love in a really good movie? You look at your watch like 2 hours. How's that possible? I know it's just when it's a bad movie because I keep looking at my watch, right? But we can train ourselves to turn off the self-talk and really attend to the other. But that's a very complicated question. Charles, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is once you're in that zone, it's hard to get out of it. So I think being kind of preemptive and thinking before the encounter, what are my goals? What are the ideas that I want to get out of this experience? Because once we get into that red zone, and what someone would call it, that is like you're kind of lost, right? You're in fight or flight, and it's hard to get out of that. I have kids at home, and I know when they start to get into a battle, all we can do is calm down. We can't talk about what we can do differently until they're calm.
Preach, brother, preach.
Right. So anyways, that's a pretty simple parenting. You learn it the hard way. It's not like I was a genius when I started it. And so it's a kind of similar thing. I think if you go into it with a set of goals where you're thinking about understanding and not agreement, that's probably your best bet to not drift into that space, right? Because once we're there, we've all been there. It's almost impossible to just snap yourself out. You have to work your way out of it.
And you can acknowledge the elephant in the room and say, for some reason, this is really distracting me, or I'm getting really upset by this. Give me a second.
Yeah.
So to acknowledge that fact.
My son and daughter go to different rooms, walk away, right? Sometimes it's the best thing you can do in those situations.
Let's get another question.
I have a question.
Please, Madam President.
My question is, my observation is that leaders today insult people's intelligence to have a different opinion, and that's become prevalent. And when you see your leaders do that, I think our children and everything else, how are we going to survive that? Because nothing in my mind cuts understanding or a conversation off faster than just saying, smart people think the way I do, dumb people think some other way. And it's prevalent, and I think it's a huge problem. That's one of the huge problems. What do we do?
I'll take that one first.
Oh man, that's a big one, and you're right. It is a huge issue in terms of democracy. The question was that our leaders, our political leaders, tend to belittle or mock the other party, the other perspective as being stupid, right? So if you're not with us, you're an idiot, you don't get it, right? You're not in the club, that sort of thing. And of course, that's all based in exclusivism, right? And it's based on that pleasure of feeling that specialness of the other. And I think it's advocating for leaders who don't do that. I know they're sometimes farther to find, especially national leaders, but you're hearing, local leadership, right? And I think sometimes we rely too heavily on this kind of nationalistic discourse in terms of defining ourselves. But I think at the local level, just like in a space like this, where everybody's listening to each other, everybody's civil, everybody's treating people who are different with tremendous respect, right, in this space. This is a model, and we just take that bit by bit into other contexts, and we think, and this is what America should be like, right? It shouldn't be like what's going on in Congress, right? And so to me, and there's by the way, there are lots of folks like y'all, right? There are a lot of people who just want to listen and understand and have these kinds of conversations. So part of it is that I think our energy, there's just something about social media, there's something about cable news that we fixate on these sort of national leaders and what they're saying as though they're representing us.
Social
Like
media.
Twitter,
Let's
right?
start with social media, please.
Social
Right,
Thank you.
right. And yeah, and thinking about the role that it has and how much because I think the big thing is they can blather on all they want. The problem is when we start to define our identity through their blathering, right? And that becomes the issue for me. And I think if we just say, no, they don't represent me, their point of view doesn't represent my point of view, then it might help us to kind of break that thinking about how we might apply those people's behavior in our own lives.
Please.
The thought on social media, like, today's college student, compared to even when I was a college student 10, 11 years ago, the notion of the world is shrinking. There's more access to information and technology, and there's all the benefits and all that kind of stuff, but there's also a decreased need for actual in-person live interaction. There's one extra buffer between two people a lot of the time. How do you guys, I mean, a lot of their world exists through a device, and how they interact socially and even educationally in the COVID world we're in now. How can you, or how can they truly grasp some of this stuff, or how have you guys had to pivot to help teach some of these practices to folks that, a lot of their interaction on a daily basis isn't with a living, breathing person sitting in the room?
You bet. And the question was, how do you deal with social media and some of the negative implications of social media? One of the things that honestly you have to do is show the evidence. I don't know if you are familiar with the Facebook papers or some of the things that came out really showing the detrimental effect. My son, who hopefully will be in med school in the fall, looked at me and said, Dad, I can't go onto Instagram anymore. It just makes me mad. So he had that epiphany as well. But I think a lot of it, we owe it to people to show them the research, because there is an addiction there. There's a dopamine response to social media, just like there are to drugs. It is an addiction. And so the question is, what can we replace it with? These are fantastic questions. And if we had a weekend, we could maybe go into this. But a lot of what we try to do is warn them about the dangers, ruin the high of social media, if you will. And if 13% of females having suicidal thoughts as a result of Instagram doesn't do it, I don't know what would. Did you want to add to that? He's the tech guru, so I probably just stepped on your toes.
Right, but it's funny to me that the one thing I teach a class in technology, we talk a lot about social media. It's the young people who are acutely aware of how dissatisfying their experiences are, right? And so then it's just a matter of what I was talking about with habits, is just starting to think about what are some of the habits that are dissatisfying and how you can engage differently. But I have more and more students that are actually disconnecting, right? They're just like, they don't use Facebook anymore. They're using Instagram less. I think there's some evidence, at least anecdotally, that there's an awareness around that's growing. I think your son is like that as well. So that's kind of the positive part of it. That many of these whistleblowers and other things that are happening is that people are realizing this isn't serving my self-interest. It's serving our company's self-interest, and that's not necessarily what I need for my life. So I think there's a movement pushing back, and I think it's kind of exciting.
Questions over here.
Okay, so this may sound a lot, I hope this doesn't come across really icky, but there are certain words that just really make me, just give me a knee-jerk reaction, one of which is diversity. I grew up in a time where none of us cared about anybody's color of their skin, or I don't think we ever talked about religion. I mean, nobody cared about any of that. And now it seems like we're making our society not less prejudiced, but more. I mean, it becomes, I just get hit over the head with diversity. I had a discussion with my daughter, and I was telling her this, and she said, well, Mom, it's because you're white and you don't acknowledge that you're prejudiced, that you are prejudiced. So I'm like, what? What? I I mean, how can I be prejudiced because I don't care what color skin is, or I may care what their religion is, and I'm not going to argue with them about it. But it's those type of things. It's like we're getting less cultured in my mind. Anyway, how do we?
Want me to give that? a
I want
try?
you to give that one a shot. It's your wheelhouse.
Yep, repeat that.
Uh, What she said,
Short version.
icky, well, the notion is how do we deal with our society that has kind of turned diversity into our sole identity as a group identity. For those of you that are any YouTube junkies out there, I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you've heard Jordan Peterson at all. One of the things that I think our educational system is doing that's a disservice is we're starting to define people by their group identity as opposed to their individual identity. And that's really fostering exactly what we're saying we shouldn't be doing. Because to say, if I know your group, I know you, social scientifically, rationally, that's just, can I say it? That's just stupid. That's just stupid. Yeah, I didn't know either. I didn't know.
I was thinking worse words.
Okay, well, you used icky, so I was ready to say something really nasty up here. Like poopy head. I think what's happening is our schools are attempting to make people aware of some very serious issues in social justice, but in doing so, they're gutting the very notion of individualistic identity, and I think that's a mistake. That's my point of view. That's not UNC's point of view. That's not Charles's point of view. That's only my point of view. Charles, what would you say?
Yeah, I would agree. And it's what's that?
I'm just kidding. I said you better agree with them.
Right, exactly. Right. And part of it is, yeah, just anything that silences people or makes people feel as though they can't have a voice, I think is inherently problematic, right? And I think it's one of the things that we're facing in so many different contexts today. And I think one of the things that we talk about is just thinking of diversity in a different way, rather than it being this politicized notion, right? Where it becomes this grenade that's thrown about, and instead is just a source of strength, right? We have all these different types of people and all these different types of experiences that people have, and how that can be a place for us to become stronger. If you know anything about things like groups and how we make decisions, the more diverse the ideas, the better. If you know anything about the founding fathers of the country, they were big advocates of having many different points of view and people feeling comfortable sharing all of those points of view. And that's it. That's all diversity needs to be, right? It doesn't have to be liberal or conservative or this or that or right or wrong. It's just something that I think is a kind of value in democracy in so many different ways. And that to me is a different way of maybe thinking about the term, because I agree it can be used as a way of leveling shame on people, and that can be obviously a source of a lot of complexity in terms of our political discourse. And I don't necessarily see that as a positive thing and moving forward in terms of so many of these social justice issues.
We would say, using our model, the notion that's a very exclusivistic notion, which is to say, you either acknowledge the problem and think this way, or you are part of the problem. There's only two camps, so pick your camp. There's a very interesting book by John Warder, for those of you that anyone know John Warder, by the name of Woke Racism. He's an African-American academic at Columbia University. He's talking about the movement that you're talking about as well, how it's really antithetical and demeaning to members of the African-American community. So that's a hot topic right there. We could go for a while on that one.
Question is, and I'm not exactly what the point is, but I have several people that I can play off with, I can lunch with, I can patient with, and talk about all different other types of topics. But we cannot talk politics because there's no common ground. Open and closed door, which is how do you try to address that issue? Help me understand your thoughts on this. It doesn't get so does that, we should have to accept that and say, okay, friends of mine, don't go there or don't
Take over on the shuffles. Okay, tag me in. I understand. My brother-in-law and I fast friends, but we disagree on the law. What I tend to do is get away from the categories and talk about experience, because there's some authority in experience. So whatever the issue is, tell me what you've experienced that makes you think this policy is a good thing, as opposed to the notion of, well, that means you're in this camp. And if you're in this camp, here's all the things that the other camp has done, and they'll try to demonize you and try to make you feel as though you're less than. So we really advocate the notion of the authority of experience. So you're not talking as a member of a party, you're talking as a person who has lived experiences that are important to you. And so the notion of talking categories, again, is dangerous. Just like, what does it mean to be Roman Catholic or evangelical Christian? What does it mean to truly be conservative? Does that mean you're a George Will conservative? Or what does that mean in the way? So it's better to get at what are your experiences? What does that lead you in beliefs? And what do those beliefs lead you into terms of policy? One of the dangers I see is people are getting very strong political and religious attitudes, but know very little about politics or religion. And that's the real danger. Stephen Prothero, who's chair of the religious studies department at Boston University, said, we are the most fervent nation in religion, but the most ignorant at the same time. So I think part of it is going beneath the level of what category are you? Charles, what would you say?
Yeah, and I think that when I talked about reciprocity, so trying to lead with just storytelling. What was your journey to wherever you are politically, and maybe they'll reciprocate that. But also, like I talked about with my kids, sometimes you just walk away, and you're just like, if people just want to yell at you, then you don't have to listen. I don't think there's any reason we should get ourselves bludgeoned, and there are going to be people like that. That's just the nature of the world that we live in. There are going to be people who are going to want to come in hot, but they're so limbic in their energy, right? That just the word politics, there's very little you can do. And I think one of the things our model can do is just help you to recognize that, because it's just like, okay, cool, whatever, we'll just talk about something else, like you said. And sometimes that is probably the best thing to do, because based on our model, there's not really any point in just digging in your heels and screaming at each other. It's just going to make you all pretty miserable, I think. So.
Never said it was good to talk about your similarities so you get common ground.
Jean's comment was, it's good to talk about common ground. I agree. As long as common ground doesn't turn into, let's ignore the differences. So I only get to know part of Jean. And what's wrong with disagreeing? That's the one thing that's really odd. When we get together with individuals, we feel as though if we disagree, there's something wrong with our relationship. That doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. One of the things that John F. Kennedy realized is that he and his cabinet had people that would agree with him. And it was a big mistake. It was part of the reason the Bay of Pigs disaster happened. One of the things he did, he left the room, said, you guys talk and I'll come back in. So the notion of difference really is a source of strength. But I think what you're saying is build the bond through similarity and then explore the difference. That could be very viable. Fire here.
Yeah. You're not holding back.
And meeting is
Appreciate it.
over. I actually am a fairly big fan of Jonathan Haidt. Any Jonathan Haidt fans here? By the way, I don't get kickback on any of these books. He wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, and his comment, which I agree with, is attempting to protect people from offensive ideas is a disservice, because we grow stronger by facing voices we disagree with, as opposed to this notion of safetyism. He equates this to our immune system. And the notion there is if we never encounter any viruses, our immune system is going to be incredibly weak. So we have to expose ourselves to those things we may not disagree with, and it makes us stronger, more resilient people. So I think the notion of protecting people from ideas that they might not agree with is a disservice to all of us. But that's straight out of Jonathan Haidt. You want
to jump in? Yeah, and I guess I would concur with that. I don't think there's too much more to add to it. Yeah, the politics around college campuses are just complicated, and being in the crosshairs of all of that is an interesting time. I'll be honest, it is interesting.
Wonderful.
There was a chat question.
chat box.
So click right there.
How do you dissect the statement? We'll just have to agree to disagree. I think that's a great last question. Let's get it asked and answered.
I disagree with that, so we're gonna have to agree to disagree. Always a punchline. That works for those of you that have studied conflict management. That works when the issue is really not that important to either party. And so, or there's a value system that really can't be resolved. And so that has to be one of the premises of entering that discussion of otherness. That sometimes the very notion that you don't agree, that's okay. That's absolutely okay. I mean, I don't know what it is. I listen to a full spectrum of political thought, full spectrum. But I do it not because I want to find agreement, because I want to be informed. So again, why are we constantly thinking that agreement is the ultimate standard for communication? Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think it to some extent goes to social media. I think the framework of argument, bad argument, right, not good argument, is the framework that we've experienced so frequently in the last, particularly decade, I think. And I think, you know, for those of you that are talking about, you know, old times and other eras, I think people just didn't argue as much, right? I think that's part of it, is that one of the things that Twitter just, for instance, kind of compels in people is this idea that we're always in the state of arguing, right? That's the frame of the experience. I think argument has a very narrow kind of contextual purpose, but it's not something that we should be doing every day. I don't even know why you would sit at work with a colleague and I don't even understand what the purpose of that is, right? Are you gonna convince them that these are their core beliefs, right? It's their religion or their politics. These are things that they've developed over the course of a lifetime. You think in the break room, you're gonna yell at them for 10 minutes and suddenly they're, oh, I see it from your point of view now. That's not how the world works, right? That's preposterous, nor is that even how we want the world to work. So I think we argue so much more than we ever should, and we should understand when is argument the purpose of conversation, right? It's one of the basic ideas of communication. Know what the function, why are we talking right now? What is the reason? If you're on the golf course or you're in the break room, like, what are we doing right now? And more often than not, you're just developing rapport and you're developing understanding. That's all you're really intending to do. Well, why would you argue in that situation? It's antithetical to your purpose. And so to me, it's just a rethinking of so many of the norms that have developed, I think, largely out of the sort of social media and cable news era where everybody comes in so hot that we're just, I think, conditioned to think in those terms.
The very last thing I'd say, I'm kind of doing a book tour here, I guess. Hate sells. There's a book out called Hate Incorporated. And what a lot of our media outlets are realizing is the way to keep people on social media or keep people tuned into the 24/7 cable news is to get them upset. And that's how you keep them. So unfortunately, I think the production of revenue and keeping of viewers has led to a model that is really detestable. So Hate Incorporated really shows that it's a viable business model.
Adrenaline is addictive drug.
Exactly. Yep.